No worries. So I did find a place to live, which was good news. And it seemed like the pandemic was abating. And it seemed like there was the possibility that things were getting better. And then whammo, we have Ukraine. And I haven't even mentioned racism and social injustice, and who knows where else we could go with it all, right? So how do we stay cheerful in the midst of all of this and not land in a slough of despond or despair? I love that expression. How do we not become angry, angered by a sense of futility in our own response? And how do we deal with the accumulation of moral distress that we find ourselves experiencing? Because I think we do find ourselves in the middle of moral distress at what we see happening in our world, and sometimes it feels like we're impotent to do anything about it. I'd like to say that it doesn't really matter what side we're on. Any war is a saddening occasion. Death and destruction, no matter what, refugees, destroyed economies, etc. It's hard not to grieve, at least for me. Now, Jack Kornfield, several years ago, when things were rough, wrote a little piece, somewhat in poetic form, about how to respond at times like these. And I'm going to intersperse his words with my own. He begins, when times are uncertain, difficult, fearful, full of change, they become the perfect place to deepen the practice of awakening. Whatever your point of view, take time to quiet the mind and tend to the heart. Quiet the mind and tend to the heart. First, these are my words, first, breathe. Really, it's amazing what a calming factor the breath can be. Sit still and breathe and stay present. Don't let the mind run wild with fantasies about what could happen. And while we're breathing, deeply notice, deeply listen to what you feel like. What are you feeling? What are you feeling in your body? And offer some loving kindness to yourself. So this to me is how we quiet the mind and tend to the heart. Breathe, offer loving kindness. Zen Buddhism is all about seeing reality for what it is as it is, looking directly and not turning away. As I said, listening deeply. So perhaps we start from out of that listening and that seeing to speak how it is for us, to say, to name how we're experiencing things. And I'm hoping that we'll have a bit of opportunity for that tonight, because I think that's how we actually start to heal. But in the midst of that, it's important to look at and to see the truth. And we can wonder what that really means. Which reality is it that we're seeing clearly? What truth? But the point is to turn towards what is happening and to know it as best we can. And it's this willingness to see, to turn towards, that is what breaks the heart. And when the heart breaks, it breaks open. Being most intimate with reality. Out of this intimacy arises sympathy, empathy, loving kindness, compassion. They pour forth from this broken heart. What a blessing that broken heart is. So Jack continues, after breathing and quieting the mind, he says, then go out and look at the sky. And I might add, or look at a belly flower. A belly flower is a flower that's so tiny that you have to get down on your belly to see it clearly. We have an expression in one of our sutras that we recite every day. When minute, infinitesimally small becomes, when large, it transcends all dimensions space. So Jack is pointing us towards the spaciousness of the sky, and we can actually find that spaciousness in a little belly flower as well. And to me, space is an amazing thing. You know, it holds everything, and it holds anything. And sometimes I think space is a synonym for enlightenment. So the spacious mind. Jack continues, remember vastness. There are seasons to all things, gain and loss, praise and blame, expansion and contraction. I think it can help us to remember that these times are not exceptional. This is the way it always is. I don't mean that to be depressing. I mean that to say, we've done this before, we can do it again. Jack says, learn from the trees. And I would add, or the rocks, or the boulders, or the mountains, or the oceans. Jack says, practice equanimity and steadiness. Learn from the trees, practice equanimity and steadiness. Remember the timeless Dharma amidst it all. So we can remember that there is that which is greater than our distress, and that which is greater than ourselves, and that is a true refuge. And remember that it is always there helping us. Jack writes, think of the best of human goodness. And isn't it so? It's so true. You know, when things get really bad, we see the best in ourselves and each other. When COVID broke out, we saw how everybody instantly began helping, making masks, bringing groceries, whatever it was, calling someone who was alone, howling together. We did that in this neighborhood. And we can, you know, in the current circumstance with Ukraine, think of all the people who are offering aid to refugees or sending humanitarian aid to the Ukraine, whatever it is. People's goodness appears. And isn't it a blessing to see that? Jack continues, let yourself become a beacon of integrity with your thoughts, words, and deeds. Integrity of speech and action, virtue and non-harming bring blessings. So in other words, take responsibility for yourself, for ourselves. Jack began this, the importance of sitting still and of quiet. And here I want to put in a plug for the precepts, which I think is what he's pointing to. Keeping the precepts changes the world. The ultimate precept is to act like a Buddha. What would that look like? I'd like to suggest that it might have something to do with not being angry or being careful about how we use or express our anger, to not belittle or discount others, whatever their point of view, to remember that we are all one, interconnected, no matter what someone is getting up to. And we can ask ourselves, how do we live that? How do we live from that place of interconnection? Beacons of integrity, taking responsibility for ourselves. Jack writes, remember the noble truths, no matter the politics or the season. So there is suffering in this world. And there is also nirvana. It's important not to forget that third noble truth. We are called to look deeper than suffering to the place where freedom from suffering exists. Jack says, greed, hatred, and ignorance cause suffering. Let them go. Love, generosity, and wisdom bring the end of suffering. Foster them. Sage advice. And these are things that we can always practice. This is our work. This is our work. Fostering love, generosity, and wisdom. Jack continues, remember the Buddha's counsel. I love this. Hatred never ends by hatred, but by love alone is hatred healed. This is the ancient and eternal law. So you'll recognize that as a quote from the Dhammapada. And as I said, I love it. It's always true. Never does hatred help. So let us not hate the Russians or the Ukrainians or each other. We must know that they and us, we all have Buddha nature. We can always look for that glimmer of Buddha nature in each one of us and love and support and speak to that glimmer of Buddha nature. So then listen to this. I'll read the rest of Jack's poem. It's quite wonderful. The human heart has freedom in itself to choose love, dignity, and respect. In every circumstance, embody respect and cultivate compassion for all. Let yourself become a beacon of Dharma. Amidst the changes, shine with courage and trust. This is your world. Plant seeds of goodness and water them everywhere. Then blessings will grow for yourself and for all. So I would like to underline what Jack says here. We always have choices. The human heart has freedom in itself to choose love, dignity, and respect, he says. We have choices about how to respond and about how to live now. We're not victims of our grief and our despair. I don't know how many of you, maybe all of you, maybe none of you, are familiar with the work of Joanna Macy, who's a Buddhist teacher and political activist, works on behalf of the environment, started out with a lot of anti-nuclear work, moved over to include the whole environment and social injustice generally, I would say. And she developed a program called The Work That Reconnects. And as I understand it, I've never participated in her workshops, but as I understand, I admire her greatly. The Work That Reconnects begins by having people voice what is so distressing to them in our world as it is now. And this whole process of voicing, it entails some of the things I've been talking about. It entails looking at reality and seeing it clearly and straightforwardly, seeing what's really going on, kind of underneath all our views and opinions. And this connects us to the reality of the world as it is. And this, just simply speaking, what's going on for us seems to have a tremendously healing effect for people, to share that with each other, to, in a sense, voice the despair and the discouragement. Because once that's done, there's a way in which we're able to embrace the situation, in a sense, to re-own it and make it again ours. We are able to cop to, accept the fact that this is the reality we have to live with. And this is the reality we have to work with. And now we can begin that work. And then there is her notion, Joanna Macy's notion of the great turning. And this great turning really involves a whole shift away from what we might call, domination systems and capitalist types of economic systems towards a world that's based in love and compassion, sharing and generosity. And it's a wonderful vision she's got. And yet I think that, she's not terribly optimistic. And I tend to share this view with her. And again, I don't mean to be depressing or discouraging or despairing, but I'm not sure that we're going to make it, at least in the vein that we're going now, that something large has to shift. And I don't think human beings will die out exactly, but I think there will be a lot of changes and that there will be some relatively serious repercussions for all of us in those changes. And, if the great turning could be enacted is a better word, that would be great, wouldn't it? And to a certain extent, I see that as our work now. But Joanna says, if we're going to go down, we can choose to go down with dignity and grace and respect for all beings and things. And in a sense, she's echoing Jack's words earlier in the poem, where he encourages us to choose dignity and respect. Whether we go down or not, we can choose dignity and grace and respect for all beings, for all things that exist, along with gratitude for all that we have and all that we have been, because it's really been amazing, hasn't it? And we can never forget that. Now, I also think that we can completely trust things exactly as they are. And actually, I thought I'd given a talk to this group on that topic, but it turns out I gave it to another group. So I'm kind of tossing it out at you, because in some sense, it's very counterintuitive. How can we trust this mess that we're in? But I think that trusting things exactly as they are is the way to true contentment. And the only way we can get there is with a non-discriminatory mind, by not positing a separate self, by letting go of all the biases that determine our opinions. From these opinions that we hold on to, anger arises, hatred grows, and there is opposition and separation. And even if we don't feel hatred, it's very easy to create opposition and separation, to feel that we ourselves are separate from the rest of what's going on. But if we can drop off our opinions, if we can drop off the discriminatory mind and enter into trust with a capital T, this, I think, is the way to true contentment. We see that reality is undivided and that we are a part of it, not separate from it. 2 more pieces of advice. I would suggest spending time with friends, particularly spiritual friends. Don't isolate yourself. Community gives us hope, unless you get into a community that's too discouraging. But generally speaking, community gives us hope. That's why I say especially spiritual friends. A community of spiritual friends supports who we truly are. and it highlights Buddha nature. So spend time with like-minded friends who don't support your delusions, but support your unfolding. And finally, there is joy. Actually, joy is inevitable when we turn toward the reality of our grief. When we try to turn away from our grief, we're repressing joy as well. When we're actually willing to enter into our grief and see and feel it clearly, our grief, our sadness, our sorrow, joy arises in the midst of that. It sounds paradoxical, but it's true. Joy is accessible even in the most dire of circumstances, even when everything seems completely awful, completely lost. But we, again, must choose. We choose joy. It's not something you sit around and wait for it to arise. You choose it and you turn towards it. We have to open to it. And the question is, are we willing to do that opening? So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there because I'm interested in what you might all have to say. And, I did ask in the email that went out to you, if you have your own experience of this kind of despair or discouragement, and if you'd like to describe it, because as I said, sometimes just voicing these things can really help. But also, how do you use your understanding of the Buddha's teaching to train with this? What helps you in these kinds of times? We could just start with that, or any other comment you'd like to make, questions, whatever, what's on your minds?
Vivian, it's Gabrielle.
Hi, Gabrielle. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm fine. I remember you.
Well, I remember you too. I'm glad you have a good place to live.
Thank you.
I think the hardest thing for me in this epidemic has been to accept the reality that there is suffering we can't do anything about.
Yes.
I'm a career ICU nurse. I've been taking care of nurses in the hot spots on Zoom for 50, 60 hours a week for over 2 years.
Wow.
I spent 10 years in war zones before 35 years in ICU and ER and trauma. And I think the hardest part about the path for me is that we know the Four Noble Truths. We know the Eightfold Path is the way out of suffering, but a lot of people don't have that opportunity. And especially when, all hell is breaking loose and they are desperately ill or the nurses are under extreme stress and grief, they don't have access to that. And it's what soldiers call moral injury. Because
Right.
they have to do in war zones or feel they have to, and then have to live with the consequences. And the same thing is true for nurses and doctors. And I think that's been the hardest part of the last 2 years, is accepting not everyone's ever going to have the way out of suffering. And some of them are going to live and die with that. And I had to just accept that is how it is and not beat myself up because I can't fix everything.
Exactly. Exactly. And first of all, thank you for all the work you've done. It's incredible. And we're very fortunate that there are people like you out there doing it. This whole notion of moral injury, I think, I tried to make reference to it in the talk. It's what did I say somewhere at the beginning? Something about the accumulation of moral distress. We're in these situations that we know are morally wrong in some way, and we can't do anything about that. And there's a way in which war is inherently that way. We're out killing each other and destroying things, and we can't support that morally. So our innate basic sense of what's ethically right and appropriate and proper is injured. And I think that's a really serious breach of our humanness, and of our ability to live with ourselves, quite frankly, and to carry on. And maybe a huge part of, the distress that people who have been to war feel later in life. And of course, working with the pandemic offers similar conundrums, not quite the same way, but similar conundrums. Gabriella, I think you're right. There's a point, other people don't have the Four Noble Truths. There is a little bit we can do to encourage others. And at some point, we can't solve the whole thing. We just simply can't. And that's what I meant by the futility I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. The futility in our response, that compared to the size of the problem, there's so little that we can do. And yet, as you say, we have to live with what we do, and that has to be good enough. And it really does, because I can't even imagine doing what you do for 60 hours a week. And, there's a point at which we just can't do any more. We're limited human beings. So we offer what we have to offer, but we also have to take care of ourselves, or we can't continue to offer. And I think that caring for ourselves is really critical in these kinds of situations, because without it, we're completely lost. And then we offer what we can, and then we have to let it go. And I think it's part of the letting go that we do is such a radical part of our training. The Buddha teaches us to let go of everything. That's what our meditation practice is. Letting go of whatever arises. Letting go, letting go. And this is one of those things that's really hard to let go of. And yet it's what we must do. And there's no easy resolution to all of that, I don't think. We're in you're in a terribly difficult situation, and you do the best you can and you let it go. Does that respond to you at all, Gabriella?
It does. In fact, I think you're pointing to something that I've had to learn the hard way over the last many years of my life, is detachment.
Right.
And be able to be in a place of compassion. And sometimes I cry with the nurses.
Yes.
I do. I cry with them, knowing that compassion is not going to fix them. It's the only thing I can give them, the loving kindness, the compassion, the presence, knowing it's not going to fix them.
Right. And I think you're absolutely right about detachment. Detachment is not indifference, but detachment is freedom from suffering in a certain kind of way. And it's hard to learn. It's hard to learn to find the kind of detachment that isn't cold indifference, and to have the compassion that you're talking about. I applaud you. It's remarkable.
Well, thank you. Your sentiment is something I first learned from Thich Nhat Hanh many years ago, when I was too young to understand it. I'm almost 70, and I'm finally coming to some level of understanding that, detachment is not indifference, and somehow you have to find the balance.
Right. Exactly. Yep. And all of these things, it takes all of us time to understand these things. And I think it's important not to beat ourselves up for the time it takes. It just takes whatever time it takes. And the fact that we're doing the work, that's what matters. Thank you, Gabriella.
Thank you.
Barbara.
I'm moving on the screen. Thank you.
You are.
I raised my hand because this week, I've been listening to Thich Nhat Hanh because I have been so bereft with what's happening in Ukraine, and I couldn't find a way to find my own seat. And I heard Thich Nhat Hanh say that physical violence is violence, but doing nothing is also violence.
Mm.
You know, and so that really touched me. And I still felt like, what can I do? Because the truth is, I don't understand what my government is doing, how we might even be involved. I have no idea. And so what I decided was that to come back to my breath and to come back to my human difficulties and to recognize, okay, this is something that was been kind of annoying me. And I thought, okay, I have to sit with looking at it in a different way to understand, what didn't I take care of in myself that it even became a thing, you know, so for me, just coming back, I decided to just to keep working on myself. And to be grateful for consciousness. And you know, like this week I've been listening and participating with a racism consciousness for therapists. So I just thought, as a human, I still have to work on that, and then sit with recognizing there's this huge Bhagavad Gita, out of my stroke, I don't talk well, that I don't understand the pieces, and I probably won't. So part of me is even like, what is going on here that I even was born here? You know, the bombs are not falling here.
Yeah.
You know, I get very scared and angry, and the whole racism and violence in this country. And so I just keep working on raising my consciousness, raising my skills, recognizing, well, I didn't do that very well, you know, and then just with the silence and recognizing the small consciousness that I have, and just being as present as I can.
And, you know, I think every little step that we take like that helps. You know, it's really striking what Thich Nhat Hanh says, that doing nothing is a form of violence too. And I think you're absolutely right, that the one thing we can do is come back to our breath. We can quiet the mind. We can notice the little irritations we have at the people around us and recognize that that's the beginning. That's the little seed out of which war grows.
Right.
You know, and so every time we address one of those irritations and don't act on it, or if we've already acted on it, we heal it in some way. We make amends in some way. We apologize, whatever it is. All of that is a step towards Joanna Macy's great turning, you know, living from compassion and love rather than hatred and domination, to draw, you know, an extreme picture of it. And this work we do on ourselves is incredibly valuable. It's also great when, you know, you can support the ICU nurses. It's great when you can make an offering to aid to Ukraine. Not everybody can do those sorts of things, but we can all sit still in meditation. We can all work on the precepts. We can all guard our own minds and hearts so that we ourselves are not spewing more anger and hatred into the world.
Do you have any thoughts about our responsibility in terms of, I can't think of the words, that I was born here. Why? You know, what am I supposed to be more aware of that I'm not yet aware of? Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't know that I have an answer. I mean, I too wonder about that. How did I get so lucky that I was born here? And our luck could run out, you know, someday we could be, you know, hit with missiles from North Korea or whatever, you know, or the big earthquake happens or, you know, something. You know, but I sometimes think, gosh, you know, not only was born here, I was born after World War II.
Right.
It's been relatively good, you know, everything's happening everywhere else. And, you know, you could call that good karma, you know, the results of good karma from past lives. I once asked my own master about that very thing. What am I to do? You know, why am I the fortunate one? And he said, you know, it doesn't really matter, but being the fortunate one, don't waste it by being grumpy and gloomy about things. Appreciate what you've got and do the work you can from where you are. And that helped me a lot. I don't know that I have other great insights into where we should be going or how to do that. I only know that I can sit where I am and take the next step. What can I offer from where I am now? And it's not going to be something grandiose, you know, but if I can speak kindly to the next person who crosses my tracks, if I can recognize that glimmer of Buddha nature, you know, in somebody who's homeless, you know, or whatever it is, and respond from there, that's the difference I can hope to make. And in a sense, that's what I can do from the privilege that I have, because we are all privileged, you know. You have, you know, it's hard to do that kind of stuff when you have nothing to eat and no water to drink and no heat and it's winter, you know.
Right.
And it's really remarkable the way that the people in Ukraine are helping each other actually in the midst of very painful conditions. Yeah. Helen.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful talk. I feel inspired. And there was one thing you said that's kind of resonating with me, and I wanted to repeat it and to ask you to talk a little more about it and say a thing or two. So you said, look deeper than suffering. You said, remember the noble truths and look deeper than suffering. Look to the third noble truth, because there's also nirvana. And I really love that, because I always think, oh, you know, I'm fooling myself. I need to look deeper than this silly happiness and see the suffering. But you turned it upside down, you know, because I always feel like it's my responsibility to face facts, and I tend to be, you know, a little crazy positive. So, but but I love that idea of looking deeper than the suffering and to see that joy is a choice anytime, no matter what's going on. We can foster, you said, we can choose love, dignity, and respect. That's just so helpful. And anything else you want to add or comes to mind around that? But thank you.
You're welcome. You know, I think I would just add that I think it's really important to remember that we have this kind of choice, because despair is really easy, you know. In fact, one of our monks once said that despair is a breakage of the precepts, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. And
Wow.
there's no precept that says do not despair, but if we look at what the precepts are pointing us towards, there is a way in which despair is not the truth. And it's choosing to buy into something and wallow or indulge something that is only one aspect of what's going on. And so I think it really, we have to make a choice to make a choice, if I can put it that way. This notion that we can choose, and to a certain extent, this is a really awesome aspect of our humanness, that we can make choices. And I think it's just really important to return to that over and over again, because when despair arises, it can cover everything. And we can forget, oh, I don't have to stay here. And I'm not suggesting that it's easy to disappear it. You know, oh yeah, I'm going to be jolly and everything's fine, because everything isn't fine. But there is, in the midst of the despair, also this glimmer of light. And that glimmer of light is always there. And I think we really have to consciously turn towards that. And in a sense, show that light to other beings. And maybe that's part of a response to Barbara as well, in terms of what we can do. And in some ways, because we are privileged, we have access to that light in a way that others don't. And there is that which is deeper than suffering, nirvana. There is nirvana, there is Buddha nature, there is that which is greater than ourselves. And we can forget all that and, you know, land in the slough of despond, you know, or we can remember that and turn towards it and keep turning towards it and ask it to help us. You know, we sometimes feel ridiculous asking the Buddha to help us. That can be too religious in a sense for us. But I think there are forces out there that do come to our aid when we really ask. And so it doesn't hurt to try, you know. You know, I also just a second, Diane, I had a thought also in response to Barbara. We can also offer merit. And I don't know how much a part of your tradition that is, but we can offer the merit of our meditation practice. Yeah, Mary Helen? Yeah.
I was just saying, so, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. You know, we can offer the benefit of our practice and training, whatever form it takes, for the benefit of all beings. And that can help too, in mysterious ways that we don't understand. Diane?
Yeah, I really like thinking that not only am I not adding to the problems by being angry and in despair, but I am taking a position to try to bring as much goodness into the world as possible. Even though there isn't anything I can really do about this, and I feel guilty that, you know, I'm okay and so many people aren't.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you're talking about this, and I'm able to value, you know, the Buddhist belief system here and use it to support myself, you know, during this. And also I appreciate you saying we did live in a sweet spot of time where all this wasn't, anyway, in Europe. I mean, in other countries, yes, but you know, in our venue, we, after World War II, and what were we thinking, that it wasn't going to happen, you know?
Right.
and the whole environmental issue, you know, too. What is humanity doing to itself? It's way bigger. It's way bigger than us,
Mhm.
and we can only do what we can do individually. But to keep our hope up, you know, and feel like we
Yeah.
actually are doing what we can do, that's important. So thank you.
It is. And, you know, Joanna Macy is hopeful in spite of her sense that we're going to do ourselves in. And, you know, about the environment, it's frustrating because something big needs to happen to turn that around, and it doesn't seem to be happening. But there are little things we can do, and they are little, but to me, they're worth doing. You know, recycling what I can, or turning off the light when I can, or whatever it is, to drive my car less, you know, consolidate my trips, whatever it is. Those little things I think matter. But I also want to say something, Diane, about guilt, because I think a lot of us are feeling guilty. You know, we're in this nice, safe place for now. And boy, isn't that wonderful. And other people are not. And it's not just the Ukrainians who are not in a safe place, you know, Syrians, Lebanese, Yemenis, Ethiopians, you know, there's lots of places that aren't safe, or you could be in Russia and unable to protest, or arrested if you protest, or in any number of China or Hong Kong, you know, any number of places like that. And I think we all know and recognize that guilt isn't very helpful. We may feel it anyway, you know, but to whatever extent we can let go of the guilt and live the life we can. You know, Diane, what you said about putting some good into the world, not acting on your irritation. That's what we can do. And we can offer that and let go of the guilt. And to the, you know, again, we can't force the guilt away. And it helps to recognize that it's there. And yet we don't need to feed it or take our seat in the midst of the guilt. See what we can do to shift ourselves in another direction. Do what we can, and that lets the guilt fall off. I see Marie's hand and Anita's. So Marie, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you. I'll try to be brief.
Yeah, I
Just
see
some
we're getting to
highlights.
the end here. Go
I
ahead.
know, watching the time.
Yeah.
One, thank you for bringing up the merit. I was thinking of it when you brought it up, how I find that powerful as much as I don't understand, but it does feel
Mhm.
true.
Exactly.
And then I wanted to share earlier this week, whether empathically or just my own life and busyness, got really kind of wrapped up, affecting sleep, feeling the fears, feeling the tension, having a hard time meditating with such a restlessness, you know, and contraction, that I finally took time out. And this is what I want to share because it brought up two insights. I took time out to do yoga that I'd been putting off too long, and in a quiet place, just dove into the contractions, you know, and as deeply and with deep breathing and just feeling the pain,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and what gets held in the body.
Mm-hmm.
That the first insight that came up, and we had discussed this a long time ago, and it always resonated, it always stuck with me, is how our busyness, or just even like that restlessness and getting wrapped up in so much, can almost be a violence towards ourselves.
Yes, very
And
much.
then when I went further into, you know, poses and stretching and, you know, and loosening things up, and started paying attention to not so much, like we talk usually like the self-judgments of the body, like, you know, it's, you know, there's too much weight here and blah, blah, blah. But I haven't felt this before, and I'm a physical therapist, and I'm surprised that I've never like really looked at this, but But after the yoga, even the self-violence towards the body, I started watching, because it was finally slowing down. Like everything was slowing down instead of the racing and restlessness. To look at how I move my body as a form of not being violent towards it.
Yes.
Because when we can get caught up in the mind, we can easily just kind of flop our bodies around and cause the tension and pain and so forth, So I just
Yes.
wanted to share that. It was really helpful.
Thank you, Marie. That is very helpful. And when we stop flopping the body around, the mind follows. So the two help each other. And Jack's first piece of advice in that poem was breathe and quiet the mind. And you did yoga. When we do something kind for ourselves that helps the world, we can tend to think that we're being selfish. But when we're kind to ourselves, it helps the world. And I think it's really important to remember that.
Yes, thank you. And it was the slowing, besides working with the contractions of the body, that I felt more available to the world, not even having to say anything to anyone, but just beaming.
Exactly. When we're rushing around, we're not available to anybody. Anita?
Yeah, I wanted to add to the perspective of what we can do, that it's almost like the luck we have is a responsibility in a way. That we have this current, anyway, peace and safety of where we live. And when things like this happen, big things like a war that seems closer somehow than some of the other wars, it's almost like the opportunity, a reminder of the opportunity to double down on practice. And to me, I'm taking it that way, because your talk and some other talks I've heard, to really get rid of that reactivity in myself, and work on doing that. And I'm lucky enough to have the time to do that, and to sit and extend my practice. And so that's what I do with my guilt.
Excellent. Excellent. Yes. I think that's very true and very important. In any, even stopping for 3 breaths in the middle of the day is a bit of practice that helps. Our lives can be our practice. We're past time. I'm thinking we should stop. I'll